But let's take it one step further and consider omnibenevolence as defined by the infinite capacity for perfect goodness, love, mercy, and justice. All properties that imply an entity who would do everything it can to minimize suffering in our world. This sounds great in theory, except for the problem that our world is obviously overflowing with a massive amount of pointless, unnecessary suffering. So if God genuinely happens to be real and deeply powerful, then he is also sitting idly by while droves of us needlessly suffer miserably. A truly omnibenevolent God therefore cannot exist simply by the mere virtue that the world is happier, safer, and more productive without smallpox in it.
This argument fails because the fact that smallpox was eliminated at some point does not entail that it was a gratuitous evil at some point before that. It's logically possible that smallpox was not gratuitous up to the point which it became gratuitous, at which point it was eliminated. Gratuitous or needless evil is that which God could have prevented without missing out on some greater good or taking on some greater evil. Notice he said, God cannot exist, quote, simply by the mere virtue that the world is happier, safer, and more productive without smallpox, end quote. But this fact does nothing to show that smallpox was a gratuitous evil before it was eradicated. He hasn't actually provided any argumentation for this evil being gratuitous. The atheist has to show that we are in a good enough position to assess the probability of whether God has morally sufficient reasons for the evils that occur.
I myself am a great advocate for precision of language, and I totally agree that we need to be able to criticize intellectual fallacies made by those whose conclusions we support. What both of them don't seem to realize, however, is the inherent chasm between natural and formal language, and therefore the gap between the things they describe. It may seem as if a certain problem or question is properly represented by some thought experiment or formal argument, but in many cases, like this one, something important is missing such that only a fraction of the real-world problem is actually addressed. What I am trying to say here is that, in my opinion, even philosophers in the tradition of Wittgenstein are not going far enough in their analytical endeavors. Formalizing one philosophical problem or another and then critically dissecting its line of reasoning is only the first step. The next step, that rarely anyone ever seems to take, with Dennett being a notable exception, has to be the meta-analysis of the language used in the argument. It is correct that stating that the world is a better place without smallpox etc. does not automatically disprove the possibility of the existence of God. What philosophy lines fails to acknowledge, however, is that the argument against God from the problem of evil does not aim to disprove the possibility of a God in general, but rather that it is not possible for God to be omnibenevolent and to allow any kind of evil at the same time. He then goes on to argue that it is not logically impossible for God to have reasons for allowing evil, which is trivially true, but trying to show that the existence of evil and omnibenevolence are not mutually exclusive means ignoring the meaning of the word omnibenevolence, or goodness. With this in mind, I'd like to clarify the argument from the problem of evil as follows. Even though we might not be able to imagine what reasons there could possibly be for creating unnecessary suffering in the world in the first place, for the sake of argument let's posit that God's plan of ultimate goodness is to guide humanity to enlightenment, which for some inexplicable reason is only possible by going through what seems to us as unnecessary hardship. Even so, the anti-theist argument from the problem of evil is not concerned with that. Rather, its claim is twofold. 1. Omnibenevolence, meaning all goodness, is an attribute given to God by humans, which means it is us humans who get to decide who is worthy of it. Just like any other, it is a word whose meaning is defined by us and does not have any absolute, intrinsic meaning distinct from our interpretation. There is no kind of omnibenevolence that only applies to God and not humans or has different meanings in each case, otherwise such a word would be meaningless and unusable in a conversation. Whether or not evil in the world is gratuitous is irrelevant and does not need to be proven for the argument to be sound. The existence of any evil at all disqualifies God from being awarded the label of all goodness. We are not talking about a plan that ultimately leads to the best possible outcome, but about the most possible amount of goodness along every step of the way. Omnibenevolence cannot be an automatic attribute of God irrespective of his intentions and actions, or the two words would become synonymous and thus lose any meaningful distinguishable characteristic. If God and omnibenevolence are identical, neither word can be used in a rational argument. 2. If it is truly the case that God needs to have evil in the world for some long-term plan to work out as intended, the evil would still be gratuitous to us simply because we cannot anticipate the end goal from our present point of view. Even if there was some greater good that we would eventually miss out on by virtue of not having overcome evil, we would not know what that would have been, and neither would future individuals be able to tell that they received some great pleasure because someone in the past suffered for them. So we would never be able to say that what God deems the better of two worlds is actually a positive thing for us. It needs to be emphasized again that we, not God, are the arbiters for the necessary qualifications for omnibenevolence. So we indeed are not required to logically prove that some states of affairs are equivalent to gratuitous evil, nor do we need to prove that we are, quote, in a good enough position to assess the probability of whether God has morally sufficient reasons for the evils that occur, end quote, because we are setting up the rules God is judged by. From our point of view, there are no morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil, not even for ourselves and certainly not for an omnipotent entity. Whether or not God disagrees with our assessment is irrelevant with respect to our judgment regarding his nature, figuratively speaking. Arguing that we need to take his opinion on the matter into account is like arguing that certain things are moral because God says they are. The statement itself is simply meaningless gibberish because it is an inconsistent, unprovable and untenable ad hoc excuse that has no bearing on our experience or attitude toward morality whatsoever. It is possible that God is still good in some limited way, like a serial killer could conceivably be a good father or husband, but all goodness is out of the question. But even then, there is a huge problem for God's goodness. If the afterlife is always better than this life, and God is allowed to make people suffer or kill them because on the whole it creates a greater good for them and have himself still be considered a benevolent character, then either it would be virtuous for humans to murder, which is a ridiculous sentiment that no one supports, or goodness is again defined differently for God, which makes the word meaningless in such a debate. Therefore, the argument from the problem of evil is perfectly consistent in showing that God cannot be omnibenevolent and have morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil at the same time, because the two terms are mutually exclusive by definition. No reason for failure to live up to perfection whatsoever can be sufficient to excuse you for not meeting the requirements and still allow you to be awarded that label. To go a little bit more in depth, I'd like to add that the second part of the argument from the problem of evil, which is not mentioned in the video, is consistent as well. In fact, the existence of evil not only shows that God would not be omnipotent if he wants to eradicate evil but cannot, it also proves that God is not omnipotent even if we grant that he could have morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil, which he can't, as I've shown before. Since if he is unable to produce a certain desired outcome of ultimate good without allowing evil, then he cannot be omnipotent. To put my reasoning into contrast with common responses to the problem of evil, I think I have to address a few of them. 1. The problem of moral evil. Probably the most well-known refutation of the problem is Plantinga's free will defense. It goes as follows: God's creation of persons with morally significant free will is something of tremendous value. God could not eliminate much of the evil and suffering in this world without thereby eliminating the greater good of having created persons with free will with whom he could have relationships and who are able to love one another and do good deeds. I will disagree with each part of Plantinga's argument. Firstly, however, it seems we have to clarify what free will actually is. Whether or not we are deterministic beings may be unknown and is in fact fundamentally unknowable to us, but is also not necessary for an adequate definition of free will, exactly because we can never know. Our reality is that we are undoubtedly convinced that we possess conscious agency with respect to most of our actions, that is all of those that are physically possible and accessible to the capabilities of our brains. Given that conviction, how would a world in which we do not in fact possess free will differ from the current one? Any accurate simulation of the universe would be indistinguishable from its original model for us, as internal observers. It constitutes a fundamental confusion that there even exists a God's eye view on the matter that has any impact on our experience. There might exist a third-order observer outside of our universe who is capable of assessing that we are in fact only a simulation of free agents in a deterministic universe, but we would never be able to tell, and the observer could never contact us without becoming part of the universe and thus subjecting himself to its properties. So in essence, being conscious of free will is free will. There is no Platonian meta-entity of free will that could in any way be greater or richer than what we experience. Therefore the assessment that free will is of tremendous value is incorrect with respect to us. Even if we had no free will and were predetermined to do whatever we think we choose to do, we would not be aware that we are deterministic and, thinking we do have free will despite that assumption being wrong, not value free will any more than we do currently. If you think this is debatable, consider the following proposition: theism, who is God, created the entire universe last Thursday, complete with all humans in their current state of being and mind, exactly the way history suggests the world was at that day, but including all our memories of the supposed time before last Thursday, which did never actually exist. If you cannot prove that your memories are not in fact fake, which you can't, then you cannot be sure if you actually have free will or just the illusion of it. In either case it is inconsequential. If our respective assumptions are correct, we certainly behave as if they were. We would still value free will highly, but given that we would be wrong in thinking that we possess such a thing, our judgment would be meaningless. That is, free will would have no actual value if it didn't exist. So then the importance of free will could only be postulated in any meaningful way by God himself. However, even if God thinks the greatest amount of goodness is constituted by humans being endowed with free will, that does not change the fact that we would not think or act differently in a fully deterministic universe that God had engineered in such a way that we believe we are moral agents when we are actually not. Either way, the statement that free will is of tremendous value is vacuous. Secondly, the assertion that God could not find a way to make free will exist in the absence of evil is an equally baseless assumption. Plantinger's interpretation of omnipotence does not include God's ability to contradict logic, that is, he could not, for example, produce a round square or make 2 + 2 = 5. Aside from the fact that these examples are horrendously nonsensical because they constitute a complete disregard for and misunderstanding of the nature of language, they are not relevant to the problem at hand. It is not necessarily logically impossible for God to make humans have free will in a world without evil. Either we would not even notice that we do not have free will, as said before, or we would simply be limited in our choices, which would, again, not be any different from how the world appears at the moment. Does it limit our moral agency because it is physically impossible for humans to fly or lift houses or breathe underwater? Suggesting so would completely undermine the concept of moral agency. So why would it impact moral agency if, for example, murder was physically impossible? Keep in mind that it may be possible to do the aforementioned things with the help of machines, but it would not be logically impossible for them to be fundamentally impossible. Moreover, there is a difference in free will being the ultimate good in and of itself and free will leading to such a thing, the latter of which has been argued for by the likes of John Hick and Eleanor Stump. If the greatest good is the existence of free will alone, then the existence of evil would not be a problem for God, which makes him evil. If the outcome that free will leads to is the greatest good, then free will is not as important and could be foregone to achieve the greatest good. William Lane Craig, for example, argues that the ultimate goodness is the knowledge of God rather than happiness. Even if that were the case, Someone who knows God exclaiming God is good to me does nothing to prove that God is not also bad to them. One good does not override all other atrocities, even if the former is greater than all of the latter combined. It is certainly not logically impossible that there are courses of action for God to make us achieve the greatest good other than free will, most notably by simply creating a world in which all humans achieve that desired outcome, like a certain state of mind, by peaceful means. It's more than ridiculous to assert that God is omnipotent but can only create a world in which character growth in sentient beings is only possible through the existence of evil, and is incapable of creating human nature in such a way that we would simply choose the good way of action rather than naturally veer to the bad one. So we are in fact in a good enough position to assess the probability of whether God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil, and thus this kind of special pleading fails even on logical grounds. 2. The problem of natural evil. God allowed natural evil to enter the world as part of Adam and Eve's punishment for their sin in the Garden of Eden. This statement is so far beyond the scope of any rational discussion that it should not even be dignified with a refutation. For the sake of completeness, though, I will say this: not only is the very idea that punishing all of humanity for the moral crime of one individual, no matter how severe, not to mention the insignificance of the actual event, can in any way be justified, exceedingly abhorrent. Additionally, events in the Garden of Eden are neither causally nor logically related to the achievement of ultimate good and can thus not serve as a reason for the existence of natural evil. At best it is an excuse from God for his incompetence, which is of course unacceptable. Just because it is not logically impossible, however unlikely, for a historical Garden of Eden as well as Adam and Eve to have existed, that does not refute the logical impossibility of the coexistence of evil and an omnibenevolent being, because, I say again, omnibenevolence excludes the existence of any evil by definition. Redefining the word to not be affected by some form of formal criticism is intellectually dishonest, disrespectful and just plain weak arguing. One of Craig's favorite sentences seems to be morals are grounded in God ontologically. I say sentence, not argument, because it is unclear what this is even supposed to mean. Not I am redefining morality or omnibenevolence when I state that God does not meet the requirements for a moral and benevolent being, rather Craig is redefining the meaning of morality. Or more specifically, he is draining the word of any meaning with this statement. Let's say we grant that morals are in fact grounded in God ontologically. Okay, so now what? Nothing happens. We are not injected with a sudden epiphany about what is moral and what is not. All that says is that God knows what he claims is moral. Good for him. But I have no idea what his concept of morality entails, and neither do I care as long as we are oblivious. And I sure hope no one dares to claim we know what God's morality looks like. Essentially what Craig is saying is that morality, like God's true nature, is unbeknownst and unknowable to us, thereby implicitly admitting that objective morality does not exist. Additionally, contrary to the overly common claim that we cannot state what ought to be, or more ridiculously even that stating what we think ought to be implies that there is some sort of cosmic plan, is entirely confused thinking. When we say a tsunami killing thousands of people is a bad thing, what we are really doing is expressing our disapproval. It's true that there is no moral evil behind the event, it's just that we don't want it to happen because it causes unnecessary suffering. Therefore, when we state how the world ought to be, we are doing so with respect to a certain kind of expectation or requirement that is imposed by us. In full the claim thus reads: in a world without evil, tsunamis ought not to kill humans because they cause suffering. We'd really appreciate it if our world was perfectly good to everyone, but since tsunamis kill people, it is not. That is the standard against which good and evil are measured in any meaningful discussion, not against an arbitrary God figure. No matter how assertive theists are in their insistence that God's position for allowing evil is in any way defensible, that position is philosophical nonsense. Period. As a result, neither of these arguments serves in any way to convince that God can have morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil. Sure, it is trivially true that he can have some sort of reason, but the claim that this reason is anything other than evil is utterly unconvincing and can wholly be rejected. In conclusion, both the initial argument that the assessment that some evils are gratuitous is unfounded and that it does not automatically follow that God cannot exist even if some gratuitous evils exist, are factually correct, but also entirely beside the point. This line of reasoning shows why analytic philosophers are generally rather ill-respected, especially among natural scientists, and why philosophy is often ridiculed for not producing any tangible results of common value. This insistence on trying to argue about fuzzy metaphysical concepts entirely within the boundaries of formal logic is, despite the definitive need for rational inquiry and precise language, rather counterproductive and, contrary to philosophy-line's apparent belief that atheists are failing to recognize their burden of proof, does nothing to further the discussion. Despite all of this, I have to emphasize again that the problem of evil and all the arguments I have brought forth do not in any way disprove the possibility of a God in general. We can, however, state with authority that theistic gods who allegedly unify omnibenevolence and omnipotence cannot exist in a universe which also contains evil. But no one is arguing against or has much of a problem with non-moralizing belief systems such as pantheism. In fact, like many atheists have often emphasized, despite ours not being the best conceivable universe, it is still a fantastically amazing place, and a hypothetical God may well be given some credit for that.